I swore I would never let love ruin me again. That was the last promise I made to myself before I buried that part of my life so deep I stopped believing it ever existed. My name is Vincent Moretti, and in this city, I am known as the man who does not hesitate, the man who does not bend, and the man who does not feel. Power became my language. Silence became my home. Every deal, every building, every person around me existed only as a piece on a board I controlled. But control is a dangerous illusion, because it only lasts until something unpredictable steps into your world and refuses to obey the rules you built. That moment began on an ordinary night that was supposed to mean nothing. I arrived at a private restaurant downtown, a place reserved for people like me who never eat alone and never sit without purpose. Everything around me was polished, calculated, and expensive enough to remind everyone who mattered. I did not notice her at first. She was just a waitress moving between tables, balancing trays with quiet focus, speaking politely to people who did not even look at her. Emily Carter was not supposed to matter in my world. She was supposed to stay invisible, like everyone else who did not belong to the life I lived. But something about her presence disrupted the order I had spent years building. It was not beauty that caught my attention. It was not charm or ambition. It was something far more dangerous. It was the absence of fear in her eyes when she looked at people like me. Most people lower their gaze when they sense power. She did not. She looked directly at the world as if she still believed it could be good. That belief should have annoyed me. Instead, it unsettled something I had sealed away long ago. I remember the exact moment she passed my table. The noise of the room faded, not because the world changed, but because my attention did. She placed a glass of water in front of me with steady hands, gave a small professional nod, and moved on as if I was just another customer. No recognition, no hesitation, no calculation. That should have been the end of it. I should have returned to my conversation, closed the deal, and forgotten she existed. But I did not. For the first time in years, I found myself observing instead of commanding, watching instead of controlling. There was something in the way she carried herself that felt out of place in my world, yet entirely untouched by it. It was not weakness. It was not ignorance. It was something closer to quiet strength that did not need permission to exist. And that was the beginning of the problem. Because men like me do not survive long when something unpredictable starts to feel important. I told myself it was nothing, just a passing distraction, just a moment of curiosity that would disappear with time. But deep down, I already knew that something had shifted. The rules I built my life on had not changed. But for the first time in a very long time, I was no longer certain they were enough to keep everything locked in place. The night should have ended there. One simple encounter, one passing moment, one face among hundreds in a city that never sleeps. That is what I told myself as I left the restaurant that evening. But silence has a strange way of becoming heavier when something inside you refuses to stay quiet. I found myself replaying the smallest details without permission. The way she moved between tables without rushing, even when the room demanded speed. The way she spoke softly but clearly, as if every word had value even in a place where most words were ignored. It was not fascination. I do not allow myself that kind of weakness. It was observation. Careful, controlled, detached. At least, that is what I kept repeating. My world has always been built on distance. Distance between people. Distance between emotion and decision. Distance between what exists and what matters. Emily Carter was not part of that structure. She was a waitress in a place I would forget by morning, a name I would never need to know, a presence that should have dissolved the moment I stepped outside into the night air. But it did not dissolve. Instead, it followed me in fragments. The reflection of city lights on glass. The echo of footsteps on marble floors. The brief moment when her eyes lifted across the room and met mine without hesitation. That last part should not have mattered. Yet it did. The problem with control is that it creates the illusion that everything outside of it is insignificant. I built my life on that illusion. Every negotiation, every alliance, every calculated move in the world I belong to depends on the belief that nothing unpredictable can touch me. But unpredictability does not announce itself. It arrives quietly. It enters through spaces you did not realize were open. The next day, I returned to my routine as if nothing had changed. Meetings, decisions, silence, power dressed in structure. People around me spoke as if I was unchanged, as if I had not spent the night thinking about something that had no place in my world. That is the advantage of being feared. No one looks too closely. No one asks what is behind the expression. But even while I signed documents and closed deals that moved millions, a part of my attention remained elsewhere. I told myself it was meaningless, a distraction created by exhaustion, a passing anomaly in a controlled system. Yet control is only real until it is tested. And I was beginning to realize something had already started testing me without permission. Later that evening, I found myself reviewing security footage from the restaurant. Not because I needed to, not because it mattered to any business I was conducting, but because I wanted to understand why a single, ordinary moment refused to leave my mind. I watched her again, the way she moved through the space, the way she never seemed overwhelmed by it, the way she existed within it without being consumed by it. There was no strategy in her behavior, no hidden agenda, no attempt to impress or manipulate. That was what made it dangerous. Because in my world, everything has a motive. Everything has a cost. Everything has a reason. And she did not fit any of them. I leaned back in my chair, realizing something I had avoided naming. This was no longer about observation. It was about interruption. Something small had entered my system and refused to leave. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not immediately know how to remove it. The thought should have concerned me. Instead, it stayed. Quiet. Persistent. Unfinished. The city felt different that night, like it was holding its breath without knowing why. I had only been working at the small downtown restaurant for a few months, just enough time to learn the rhythm of the dinner rush, the sound of silverware against porcelain, and the way certain customers never made eye contact when they spoke. I told myself that was normal, just part of working in a place where strangers came and went like passing weather. But then he walked in, and everything about that assumption changed in a way I could not explain at first. He did not arrive loudly or demand attention, yet somehow the entire room adjusted to his presence as if space itself had been reorganized around him. He chose a table in the corner, not because it was the most visible, but because it gave him a view of everything without being seen too easily. I remember noticing his calm first, the kind that does not belong to someone trying to relax, but to someone who is always aware. When I approached with the menu, I expected the usual brief exchange, order taken, distance kept. Instead, there was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional, and when he finally looked at me, it was not the kind of look I was used to receiving from customers. It felt like recognition, even though I was certain we had never met. I asked what he would like to drink, trying to sound steady, and he responded with a voice that was low and controlled, saying something simple, but somehow making it sound like it carried more weight than it should have. I told myself to focus on my work, on the tables waiting for service, on anything other than the strange pull of that interaction. But as the night went on, I noticed he did not behave like the other guests. He was not distracted by his phone, not impatient with delays, not even particularly interested in the food when it arrived. Instead, he watched, quietly, not in a way that felt invasive at first, but in a way that made me increasingly aware of my own movements, as if I had stepped into a space where I was being observed with purpose rather than chance. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking a simple customer service interaction. Yet every time I passed his table, I felt that same awareness, like an invisible line had been drawn between us without either of us acknowledging it out loud. At one point, I dropped a receipt book slightly too close to his table, and instead of ignoring it like most people would, he reached down and handed it back to me with careful precision, his fingers brushing the edge just long enough for me to notice how deliberate even the smallest action could be. He said nothing extra, just returned it, but somehow that silence felt heavier than words. As closing time approached, I began to feel an unusual sense of anticipation I could not justify. It was not fear, and it was not comfort, but something suspended between the two, like standing at the edge of a decision I had not yet realized I was part of. When he finally stood to leave, he paused near the exit, looking back once as if confirming something only he understood. I told myself it meant nothing, that he was just another customer passing through my life for a moment. But deep down, I knew that whatever had begun in that quiet corner of the restaurant was not finished, and something about the way he disappeared into the night suggested it had only just begun. The next day did not bring clarity. It brought repetition, but with a different weight to it. I kept replaying the moment from the night before while going through my usual routine, telling myself it was meaningless, just a customer who happened to sit in my section, just a quiet exchange that my mind had inflated into something larger. Yet even as I tried to reduce it to something ordinary, I found myself noticing details I had ignored at the time. The way he had never once seemed distracted. The way his attention never drifted, even when the restaurant became loud and crowded. The way he had looked at me not as someone passing through, but as someone being measured. I told myself that last thought was unreasonable, even dramatic, so I pushed it away and focused on the shift ahead. By evening, the restaurant was full again. The same tables, the same noise, the same rhythm I could usually predict. Without effort. But when the door opened and a new group entered, something inside me tightened before I even looked up. It was not immediate recognition, more like an instinct that had no clear source. And then I saw him again. He was not alone this time. 2 other men entered with him, positioned slightly behind, not speaking, not drawing attention, yet clearly not casual companions either. They took a table in the same corner as before, as if it had already been reserved without anyone needing to say it out loud. I tried to continue my work as usual, but I became aware of how the atmosphere subtly shifted around that table. Conversations in nearby booths softened without explanation, laughter faded slightly, and even the staff seemed to move with less noise than before. I approached with the menu again, forcing my steps to remain steady. When I reached the table, he looked up immediately, as if he had already known I would be the one to come over. There was no surprise in his expression, only recognition, as though my presence was expected rather than coincidental. One of the men beside him said something under his breath, but I could not hear it clearly, and I was not meant to. I focused on asking for their order, keeping my voice professional, but I felt the weight of being observed by more than one pair of eyes this time. He ordered simply again, nothing unusual, yet the way he spoke made it feel like the words carried intention beyond their surface meaning. When I turned to leave, I noticed that the conversation at the table did not resume immediately. Instead, there was a brief silence that felt deliberate, as if my departure itself was part of what they were waiting for. I walked away trying to convince myself that I was imagining patterns where none existed, that a busy restaurant and a quiet customer did not add up to anything significant. But later that night, as I prepared to close, I noticed something that disrupted that logic. He had not left with the others. He was still there, alone now, watching the room empty slowly, his attention calm but unwavering. When our eyes met from across the space, I felt the same unfamiliar stillness from the night. Before return, stronger this time, as if whatever distance I had tried to maintain was already becoming irrelevant without my permission. The days after that began to blur together in a way that made me question whether anything about my routine had ever truly been normal. I still arrived early for my shifts, still tied my apron the same way, still greeted the same coworkers who joked about tired eyes and long hours, but something inside me had shifted in a way I could not reverse. I found myself listening more closely to every sound at the entrance, every opening of the door, every pause that might signal a familiar presence returning. I did not want to admit it, even to myself, but part of me had started to expect him, and that expectation carried a weight that made ordinary moments feel slightly unreal. When he did return, it was not in a dramatic way, not with attention drawn from the street or any obvious signal. He simply appeared at the same table again, as if continuity itself had been quietly established without discussion. This time, there was no group with him, only him alone, seated in the same position that seemed to anchor itself more firmly each time he chose it. I approached with the menu, but this time I noticed something different in the way my body reacted before my thoughts caught up. My steps slowed slightly without permission, my breath felt more controlled than usual, and I became aware of the silence between us before a single word was spoken. When I reached the table, he looked up immediately, as always, but this time the pause between us felt longer, more deliberate, as if both of us were aware that repetition was turning into something else. I asked for his order, keeping my voice steady, but I noticed that he did not look at the menu this time. Instead, his attention stayed on me for a moment longer than necessary, as though the decision had already been made before I even arrived. He ordered the same way as before, calm, precise, and minimal, but the simplicity of it no longer felt ordinary. It felt intentional in a way I could not explain. After I left the table, I tried to refocus on my tasks, but I became aware of how often my attention drifted back toward that corner of the room. It was not curiosity in the usual sense. It was something quieter, more persistent, like a thread that kept pulling at the edge of my awareness without fully revealing itself. That night, as closing time approached, I noticed he did not leave when others began to do so. The restaurant slowly emptied, chairs being stacked, lights dimming slightly, conversations fading into background noise. Yet he remained, unmoving, as if time did not apply to his presence in the same way it applied to everyone else. I began wiping down tables near his section, trying to act naturally, but I felt his attention follow my movements without interruption. When I finally looked up, I saw that he was still watching, not with urgency or pressure, but with a calm certainty that made the space between us feel smaller than it should have been. I told myself again that there was nothing unusual about any of this, that I was simply overthinking a customer who chose to sit quietly in a restaurant. But as I locked up later that night and stepped outside into the cool air, I could not shake the feeling that something had already begun forming between us in the silence of those repeated encounters, something that had not asked for permission and did not seem interested in stopping. The next evening arrived with the same quiet certainty as the ones before it, but I could no longer pretend that my thoughts were unaffected by what had been happening. I tried to convince myself that nothing about this situation was unusual, that a customer returning to the same restaurant table was not worth the attention I was giving it. Yet my awareness kept betraying that logic in small, but undeniable ways. I noticed details I had not noticed before, like the timing of his arrivals, always after the dinner rush had reached its peak, never too early, never too late, as if he understood the rhythm of the place better than I did. When I saw him walk in that night, there was no hesitation in his movement, no scanning of the room, no uncertainty. He simply entered and took his place in the corner as though it belonged to him by unspoken agreement. I felt the same reaction in my body as before, that subtle tightening of attention that I could not explain or control, but I forced myself to continue with my work, reminding myself that professionalism meant ignoring distractions, no matter how persistent they became. When I approached his table this time, something felt different in the air between us, not in an obvious way, but in a quiet shift that I only recognized once I was already standing in front of him. He looked up immediately, as he always did, but there was something more settled in his expression now, as if the pattern of our interactions had reached a point of recognition that no longer needed introduction. I asked for his order, and he gave it in the same calm voice, but I found myself noticing not just what he said, but the pauses between his words, as if even silence had structure when it came from him. After I left, I tried to return to my usual rhythm, yet I became increasingly aware of how often I found myself aware of his presence without looking directly at him. It was not distraction in the usual sense. It was something more persistent, like a quiet awareness that remained active even when I tried to ignore it. The restaurant gradually filled and then slowly emptied again, but through all of it, he remained in his corner, unchanged, observing without interruption. At one point, I passed near his table carrying empty glasses, and I felt his gaze follow me, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me aware of how often I had begun to notice his attention. It was a strange realization that awareness itself had become part of the routine. As closing time approached, I expected him to leave as he had before, but instead he stayed longer than usual, sitting in silence while the rest of the staff began cleaning around him. I noticed that no one asked him to hurry. No one interrupted him, as if there was an unspoken understanding that his presence was not something to be managed like everyone else's. When I finally finished my tasks and looked up, he was still there, and for the first time, I felt a quiet uncertainty about what would happen when this pattern eventually changed, because deep down I understood that patterns like this do not continue indefinitely without leading somewhere. The shift happened so quietly that I almost missed the moment it became undeniable. It was not marked by a single dramatic event or a clear change in behavior, but rather by the accumulation of small details that no longer felt random. I began to notice that I was not the only one adapting to a pattern that had formed between us. He was adapting too. His visits were still calm and unhurried. But now there was a consistency that felt more deliberate, as if he had decided that this place, and perhaps my presence within it, was worth returning to with intention rather than coincidence. I told myself I was reading too much into it, yet I could not ignore how often his arrival aligned with my own moments of pause during the shift, as if timing itself was becoming subtly synchronized. When he arrived that evening, I felt it before I saw him, a quiet shift in the atmosphere near the entrance that I had started to recognize instinctively. He walked in as he always did, composed and controlled, and took his seat in the corner without hesitation. I approached with the menu, but this time I was aware of something I had not fully acknowledged before, which was that I was beginning to anticipate not just his presence, but the interaction itself. That realization unsettled me more than I expected, because anticipation implied familiarity, and familiarity implied a form of connection I had not agreed to consciously. When I reached his table, he looked up immediately, and for a brief moment neither of us spoke. The silence did not feel awkward, it felt structured, as if it had a place in the sequence of events between us. I asked for his order, and he gave it in the same calm tone, but I noticed something new in his expression, a subtle patience that suggested he was no longer simply observing the environment, but waiting for something within it to develop. After I left, I found myself thinking less about whether I should pay attention to him and more about why I was unable to stop doing so. The restaurant followed its usual rhythm around me, but I felt increasingly detached from it, as if part of my awareness was anchored in a different space entirely, always returning to that corner table. As the night progressed, I noticed that even when I was not directly looking at him, I was aware of his presence in a way that no other customer ever occupied my attention. It was not intrusive, but it was constant, like a quiet signal that remained active beneath everything else. Near closing time, I saw him still seated, unchanged in posture, as the rest of the room gradually emptied. No one approached him to rush the process, and no one questioned his continued presence, as if an unspoken understanding had already formed between him and the space itself. When I finally finished my responsibilities and prepared to leave, I glanced toward his table one last time, expecting the usual brief acknowledgement of departure. Instead, I found him already looking in my direction, not with urgency, but with a steady attention that made it clear that whatever this pattern had become, it was no longer something that existed only during working hours, and the boundaries I had assumed were in place were beginning to feel less certain with every passing night. The night that followed felt different before it even began, as if something in the rhythm of my routine had already shifted into a new phase that I could no longer ignore. I arrived at work earlier than usual, not because I was scheduled to, but because I felt the need to ground myself in something predictable before the evening unfolded. Yet even the familiar environment no longer felt entirely stable in the way it once did. Every movement in the restaurant seemed to carry a subtle expectation that I could not fully explain, as if I was waiting for something I had not consciously agreed to wait for. When he arrived, it was not surprising anymore, which in itself was the most unsettling part. There was no longer a moment of uncertainty when the door opened, only recognition, immediate and instinctive, as though my mind had already prepared for his presence before I allowed myself to acknowledge it. He walked to the same corner table, as always, but the simplicity of that repetition now felt like something structured rather than coincidental. I approached with the menu, but this time I noticed something in myself that I had not paid attention to before, which was that I no longer felt like I was simply performing a job when I stood in front of him. There was a sense of awareness that extended beyond the task itself, something quieter but more persistent, as if the interaction had developed its own internal rhythm. He looked up when I reached the table, and for a brief moment neither of us spoke, but the silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like continuity. I asked for his order, and he responded as he always did, calm and measured, but I noticed that his attention lingered slightly longer than necessary, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me increasingly aware of how consistently I had begun to notice those small differences. After I left, I tried to focus on my responsibilities, but I realized that my attention was no longer fully divided between work and observation. It was beginning to drift toward him almost automatically, without effort or intention. The restaurant continued its usual flow of customers, conversations, and movement, but I felt slightly removed from it, as if part of my awareness was anchored in that single corner of the room regardless of where I physically stood. As the evening progressed, I became aware of a change that was difficult to define, not in him alone, but in the space between us. It was as if the repeated encounters had created a structure that neither of us had openly acknowledged, but both were now operating within. Near closing time, I noticed that he remained seated longer than usual, watching the room empty in silence. There was no urgency in his posture, no indication that he was waiting to leave, and no attempt to draw attention to his continued presence. When I finally finished my tasks and looked toward his table, I saw that he was already looking back, not with demand or expectation, but with a calm certainty that made it clear this pattern had moved beyond simple repetition. It was no longer about chance encounters or coincidental timing. Something had formed through consistency alone, something that neither of us had interrupted, and in that quiet realization I understood that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer confined to the boundaries I had originally assumed were in place. The final night began like the others, but I no longer experienced it as a sequence of separate moments. It felt instead like I had entered a continuation of something already in motion, something that had been unfolding quietly over time without my full awareness. I arrived at the restaurant and moved through my opening routine, but even the familiar tasks no longer fully occupied my attention. There was a part of me that remained alert in a different way, not focused on work alone, but on the expectation of a presence that had become increasingly difficult to separate from the rhythm of my evenings. When he arrived, I did not react outwardly, but internally I registered it instantly, as if my mind had learned to recognize his presence before my senses confirmed it. He entered as he always did, calm and unhurried, and took his seat in the same corner that now felt less like a choice and more like a fixed point within the environment. I approached with the menu, but for the first time I was fully aware of how automatic the motion had become, not just for me, but for the space between us that had formed through repetition. When I stood in front of him, there was no sense of unfamiliarity left. The silence between us no longer felt like something that needed to be filled. It felt complete in itself. I asked for his order, and he responded in the same controlled manner as always. But this time I noticed something different in the way he looked at me, not a change in intensity, but a change in certainty, as if the pattern we had been repeating had reached a point where ambiguity was no longer part of it. After I left the table, I found myself no longer questioning why my attention kept returning to him. That question had faded without resolution, replaced instead by a quiet acceptance that I was aware of him in a way that no longer felt optional. The restaurant continued to move around me, but I felt increasingly separated from its surface level activity, as if my awareness had narrowed into a consistent point of focus that existed regardless of my physical position. As the evening progressed, I noticed that even when I was not directly observing him, I was still aware of his presence in a way that felt stable rather than intrusive. It was no longer about surprise or curiosity. It had become something closer to recognition, as if both of us had silently agreed to maintain a pattern that required no explanation. Near closing time, the room began to empty as usual, but he remained seated longer than anyone else, watching the gradual disappearance of movement around him without any sign of impatience or departure. When I finally finished my responsibilities and looked in his direction, I saw that he was already looking back, not waiting, not questioning, simply present within the same moment I had just become aware of. In that final exchange of attention, I understood without words that whatever had formed through repetition was no longer developing. It had already taken shape. What remained was not the beginning of something new, but the quiet realization that neither of us had ever truly been outside of it.